The small town of St. Jerome, tucked between endless cornfields and the slow current of the Illinois River, had always been a place where bells marked time. The bronze bells of Sacred Heart Catholic Church rang every Sunday at 9 a.m. And folks swore they could hear them echo all the way out by the county line. Children learned to ride bikes under their chime. Shopkeepers opened their doors at the sound. And the elderly in their porches whispered a prayer when the bells tolled for the dead. For decades, those bells had been the heart of the town until the Sunday they fell silent. It wasn't a mechanical failure or the absence of a sacristan. It was deliberate. And for many in St. Jerome, the silence felt like God himself had turned his face away. It started quietly, like so many storms do. An argument after Mass, whispered in the vestibule while children tugged at their parents' coats. The town's factory, once the pride of St. Jerome, had been laying off workers for months. Families who had given everything to the church now found themselves unable to pay rent. And yet, a wealthy developer in Chicago had been buying land in town, promising revitalization. To some, it sounded like salvation. To others, betrayal. Frank Delaney, a wiry man in his 40s with deep-set eyes, stood outside the church one Sunday gripping his missal so hard the leather cracked. He had just lost his job of 19 years. "They're selling us out," Frank said to anyone who'd listen. And Father Thomas just stands up there talking about patience. Patience doesn't put food on the table. On the other side of the steps stood Margaret O'Connor, 72. Widowed, known for her blunt tongue and sharper faith. "Patience is all we have," Margaret shot back. "You want Father to wave a magic wand and fix the whole world? Maybe trust that God sees what men do in the dark." Frank spat on the sidewalk. Shame and anger twisted together. "God's been watching a long time. And all I see is men getting richer while we starve." The bells tolled noon. Their echo carried. But it didn't soothe. It sounded like a warning. Father Thomas Rivera had been pastor of Sacred Heart for 7 years. He was young, just 40, and still carried the optimism of a man who believed prayer could move mountains. But in the past year, he had begun to feel the crushing weight of leading a town unraveling at the seams. On Monday morning, he sat at his desk staring at a stack of envelopes, bills the parish couldn't pay. He rubbed his eyes, then whispered, "Mother Mary, guide me." That afternoon, the parish council gathered in the church basement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. "We can't keep the food pantry open," said Helen Grant, the treasurer, her voice shaking. "Donations have dropped in half. If we keep draining the reserves, we won't have enough for heating in the winter." A murmur ran through the room. "Tell that to the kids who come here for bread," said Deacon James, folding his arms. "We're not a business. We're a church." But Frank, who had insisted on attending the meeting, slammed his fist on the table. "You people don't get it. We need more than bread. We need justice. The factory shuts down. The land gets sold. And you sit here debating pennies while our lives are stolen. Father Thomas lifted a hand, trying to calm him. Frank, I understand your pain. No. Father. You don't. Frank's voice broke. You get your salary. You've got a roof. My kids don't know if we'll have heat next month. Silence fell. The kind that stings. That week, a group of angry men gathered in the VFW hall. They weren't the kind to usually make trouble. Most were fathers, uncles, sons of parishioners, but anger had a way of souring decent men. Frank stood among them, his jaw tight. They think they can buy us out, raise rents, and leave us crawling, said one man. We should give them something to remember. Someone mentioned slashing tires. Another suggested torching the developer's office trailer by the old factory grounds. Frank didn't speak. He just stared at the scuffed floorboards, the sound of his daughter coughing back home echoing in his mind. By Thursday, Father Thomas had heard whispers. A parishioner came to him in confession, trembling, hinting at plans for revenge. That night, Father Thomas knelt in the dark church before the tabernacle. His voice cracked. Lord, how do I preach peace when my people are drowning in injustice? How do I tell them not to fight back when the world crushes them? The red sanctuary lamp flickered. Outside, the wind howled through the cornfields like a warning trumpet. Sunday came again. Mass was heavy, as though the whole town held its breath. Frank sat in the back pew, his wife clutching his arm as if she could keep him from breaking apart. Margaret knelt 2 pews ahead, her rosary clicking with each bead. During the homily, Father Thomas raised his voice more than usual. Brothers and sisters, I know your pain. I see your suffering. And I know the temptation to lash out, to repay injustice with violence. But violence will not save us. Violence will make us slaves to anger, not children of God. A stir went through the congregation. Some nodded. Others shook their heads. After Mass, as the congregation spilled into the autumn sunlight, Father Thomas pulled the rope to ring the bells. They did not move. Someone had jammed the mechanism with a crowbar. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. People froze, staring at the still tower. Who would do such a thing? Whispered Margaret, clutching her coat. Frank turned away without answering. And for the first time in 100 years, Jerome had no bells. Great, let's move on. Here is part 2 of 5 of When the Bells Fall Silent, 1. 200 words. The following week, Jerome felt off. Without the bells, Sunday morning crept in like any other day. Farmers drove their tractors. Kids played ball in the street. And a few shop doors opened late. Some came to Mass, but fewer than before. Without the bells to call them, many stayed home. Father Thomas stood in the doorway, smiling at each soul who entered. But his heart ached. It was as though the silence from the tower had spilled into the pews. Inside, Margaret O'Connor knelt near the front, whispering her rosary. She felt it too, the town's faith cracking under the weight of silence and suspicion. She prayed harder, clutching her beads as if she could hold the community together by sheer force of devotion. Meanwhile, Frank Delaney sat in his kitchen, staring at an unopened Bible. His wife, Ellen, tried to coax him. "You should go," she said gently. "The kids need to see you there." But Frank shook his head. "I'm done listening to words that don't change anything." He didn't tell her that he'd been back at the VFW the night before, listening to men plan more than slashed tires. They wanted to send a message loud and clear. On Wednesday night, flames lit the horizon. By the time Father Thomas reached the edge of town, the developer's trailer was already engulfed. Firefighters worked frantically, but the building collapsed in on itself, sparks scattering into the night. A small crowd gathered, murmuring prayers and curses in equal measure. Frank stood in the shadows, heart pounding. He hadn't struck the match, but he hadn't stopped it either. Margaret was there too. She turned and saw Frank's face in the flickering light. For a moment, their eyes locked. She didn't say a word, but the disappointment in her gaze pierced him more deeply than any accusation. The next morning, the mayor called an emergency town meeting. Police officers patrolled outside the community center, their presence heavy. "This is arson," the mayor said, his voice trembling with controlled anger. "It's a crime. Whoever did this has endangered lives and jeopardized our future." From the back, someone shouted, "Our future was stolen already." The room erupted. Shouts, accusations, demands. Father Thomas tried to speak, raising his hands for calm. "Brothers and sisters, please." But his voice was drowned out. Margaret finally rose, her voice sharp. "If you believe violence will save us, you are mistaken. We'll burn down more than trailers will burn down our souls." Silence followed her words. For a moment, at least. The next Sunday, attendance at Mass split almost perfectly. Half came to worship, desperate for peace. The other half stayed away, angry that Father Thomas seemed to condemn them while siding with developers. After the final hymn, Father Thomas stood on the church steps, speaking with Margaret. "They don't trust me," he admitted. "They think I'm protecting the rich." Margaret adjusted her shawl. "Trust isn't given, Father. It's earned. And you'll earn it by standing with them but without condoning the violence." He nodded, but his heart felt heavy. What if no words could bridge this gap? Late one night, Father Thomas heard a knock at the rectory door. He opened it to find Frank standing there, shoulders slumped, eyes red. "I didn't light the fire," Frank said immediately. "But they're planning more. Something bigger. And if it happens, people could die." Fear prickled Father Thomas's spine. "Who? Frank? What are they planning?" Frank shook his head. If I tell you, they'll come after me. You don't know these men anymore. Desperation makes monsters out of us. Father Thomas gripped his arm. Then let me help you carry it. Confess. Frank. Bring it into the light. But Frank pulled away. Confession won't feed my kids. It won't stop them from freezing this winter. He turned to leave, but paused. I don't want blood on my hands, Father. But I can't stop what's coming. Then he disappeared into the night. That same week, Margaret had a dream. She was standing in the silent church. The statue of the Blessed Mother weeping tears of blood. The bells tolled in her dream. But each strike sounded like a gunshot. She woke drenched in sweat. Her rosary tangled in her fingers. She went straight to Father Thomas. Something terrible is coming, she told him. I saw it. He sighed. You're not the only one who feels that way. Frank came to me last night. He's terrified. I think they're planning violence against people. Not just property. Margaret gripped his hand. Then you must speak louder. Father. Even if they hate you for it. Even if they walk away. Father Thomas stared at the crucifix above the altar. He remembered Christ standing silent before his accusers. And yet, Christ's silence had spoken louder than any argument. Could he do the same? Friday evening. The local paper printed a headline, Chicago developer threatens to pull out of state. Jerome. To some, it was a victory. To others, a death sentence. If the developer left, jobs and funds would vanish completely. That night, the VFW filled again. Men talked louder, angrier, fueled by beer and desperation. This time, the talk wasn't just vandalism. Someone muttered about guns. Frank sat there, sick to his stomach. He wanted to walk out, but the weight of shame pinned him to the chair. Meanwhile, Margaret organized a candlelight vigil outside the church. Dozens came, holding rosaries, singing hymns into the night. The flicker of candles reflected in tear-streaked faces. Father Thomas walked among them, blessing each person, praying aloud, Lord, drive out darkness. Lord, heal our town. But across town, another fire was being lit, his one in the hearts of men plotting destruction. The next Sunday, Father Thomas decided he could not remain silent. He stepped into the pulpit, his hands trembling, his voice firm. I know some of you believe violence will solve our suffering. But I tell you this, every stone you throw, every flame you ignite, every life you threaten, those acts will echo louder than our bells ever did. And they will echo in eternity. He paused, scanning the pews. Frank sat in the back, his face pale. Margaret sat near the front, tears glistening in her eyes. Father Thomas continued. The world will know us not by how much we have suffered, but by how we loved in the midst of suffering. If we answer violence with violence, we will have no witness to give. No faith to hand down. We will become what we despise. For a moment, silence held the church. And then an angry voice rose. You talk about love while our kids starve. A man stood. Fists clenched. Others muttered agreement. The tension thickened like smoke. Frank suddenly rose and shouted. Stop it. Just stop. His voice cracked. I've been with you in your meetings. I've heard what you're planning. And it won't save yous, it'll destroy us. Gasps rippled through the pews. Eyes darted between Frank and Father Thomas. The man who had shouted earlier spat. Traitor. Father Thomas stepped down from the pulpit and placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. No. Not a traitor. A son who wants to save his town. The man stormed out. Others followed. But for those who remained, something shifted. And yet, Father Thomas knew the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. By mid-October, the leaves around Stay Jerome had turned amber and red. But the beauty of the season couldn't mask the unease that gripped the town. Farmers hurried their harvests. Shopkeepers locked their doors earlier. And families whispered rumors over dinner. The fire at the developer's trailer was no longer just an isolated crime. It had become a symbol either of resistance or of recklessness, depending on who you asked. Father Thomas walked the streets more often now. Collar visible. Trying to be a calming presence. Children still waved at him. But adults often turned away. He could feel it, trust was fracturing. Margaret kept organizing nightly rosaries at the church. The candles glowed like little stars in the dark. But each evening fewer people showed. Some were too afraid. Others were too angry. Frank, meanwhile, felt trapped. The men at the VFW whispered about him now, suspicious of his outburst in church. He had not betrayed them directly, but they sensed his wavering. And wavering, in their minds, was weakness. One evening, Frank drove past the old factory where he'd worked nearly 2 decades. Rust streaked the gates, and weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. Memories rose, the laughter of coworkers, the sweat of long shifts, the pride of providing for his family. Now, silence. As he sat there in his truck, another car pulled up. It was Hank Miller, one of the louder voices at the VFW. Hank leaned against Frank's window, his breath heavy with beer. You coming tomorrow night? Hank asked. Tomorrow night? We're sending a message. Bigger this time. Not just property. Frank's stomach turned. What are you talking about? Hank's eyes narrowed. Don't play dumb. The developers got reps coming in from Chicago. They're staying at the motel by the highway. Men like that don't belong here. Time we showed M. Frank's heart pounded. You're talking about hurting people. Hank's grin was cold. Call it what you want. But if you're not with us, you're against us. He tapped the roof of Frank's truck and walked away. The next morning, Frank showed up at the rectory. His hands shook as he paced in the small parlor until Father Thomas entered. "Frank," the priest said softly, "you look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." Frank's voice cracked. "They're planning something terrible. Tomorrow night. And if it happens, blood will be on my hands. Because I knew." "Then tell me." "Frank. Tell me everything." But Frank clenched his fists. "If I say names, I'm finished. They'll come for me. For Ellen. For the kids. You don't understand what these men are capable of." "Then let me go to the sheriff." "Let me." "No," Frank shouted. Then he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know what to do." Father Thomas knelt beside him. "You do know. You know the truth. And the truth demands courage." But Frank only shook his head. "Courage doesn't keep children warm at night." That evening, Margaret knocked on Frank's door. Ellen let her in, relief washing over her face as she whispered, "Talk to him, please." Margaret found Frank sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a mug of cold coffee. "You think you're the only one suffering?" she asked, voice sharp. "You think the rest of us don't know hunger? Or grief? Or fear?" Frank's jaw tightened. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything." Margaret leaned forward. "I buried my husband. I buried my son, who died in a war that wasn't his to fight. Don't tell me I don't know loss. The question isn't whether you suffer, Frank. It's what kind of man you'll be because of it." He looked at her then, eyes brimming with tears. "God sees," she said softly. "Even when the world mocks us. Even when men grow cruel, God sees. Don't trade your soul for vengeance." Frank didn't answer. But that night, he dreamed again of the factory, this time burning. Screams echoing in the distance. He woke drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. The next evening arrived too quickly. Frank tried to bury himself in chores. But as dusk fell, dread pressed heavier on his chest. Finally, unable to stand it, he drove toward the highway. At the motel, he saw them, Hank and 3 others, loitering near the back lot. Dark shapes against the glow of the neon sign. They carried baseball bats. One had something heavier tucked beneath his jacket. Frank pulled into the gas station across the street. Heart hammering. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. At that moment, a bus pulled up in front of the motel. 2 men in suits stepped off, carrying briefcases. They laughed about something, unaware of the danger lurking just yards away. Frank's hands gripped the steering wheel. He could stop this, or he could let it happen. Suddenly, headlights flared behind him. A familiar figure stepped out of the car. Father Thomas. "Frank," the priest called, crossing the lot. "What are you doing here?" Frank panicked. "You shouldn't be here." But Father Thomas's eyes followed his gaze to the motel. He saw the shadows moving closer to the men in suits. Without hesitation, he began walking across the street. "Father!" "No!" Frank shouted, jumping out of his truck. He ran after him. By the time they reached the motel lot, Hank and the others had already surrounded the newcomers. "This is our town," Hank snarled. "You people don't belong here." One of the suited men raised his hands. "We're just here to talk business. Business that ruins lives." Another man growled, lifting his bat. Before the swing could fall, Father Thomas stepped between them, collar gleaming under the neon. "In the name of God, stop!" he cried. The men froze, startled. Hank sneered, "Out of the way. Father, this doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us," Father Thomas said firmly. "You think this will save stay, Jerome? Violence will bury us deeper." The suited men looked terrified. The townsmen hesitated, bats still raised. And then Frank stepped forward. His voice shook, but it carried. "He's right. Enough. I won't be part of this anymore." Hank turned on him, eyes blazing. "Coward." "No," Frank said, louder this time. "A coward would keep silent. I've been silent too long." The bats lowered. Muttered curses filled the air. Finally, one man spat on the ground and walked away. The others followed, Hank glaring at Frank as he left. The suited men quickly fled into the motel, slamming the door behind them. Father Thomas let out a shaky breath. Frank's knees buckled, but the priest caught him. "You did it," Father Thomas whispered. "You chose light." But Frank knew it wasn't over. Hank's look promised consequences. 2 nights later, Frank's truck windows were smashed. A brick lay on the front seat, wrapped in a note, "You don't belong to us anymore." Ellen begged him to go to the police. Frank refused. "That'll only make it worse." But deep down, he wondered if Margaret had been right all along. Perhaps standing for peace was harder than any fight. Meanwhile, Father Thomas faced backlash of his own. Anonymous letters appeared at the rectory door. "You protect outsiders instead of your own." One night, someone spray-painted the church steps with the word "traitor." And yet, amidst the threats, others quietly thanked him. A single mother slipped a note into the collection basket, "Thank you for reminding us who we are." By November, the air in stay. Jerome grew bitter with frost. But the cold in people's hearts felt sharper still. Families sat on opposite sides of the diner, refusing to speak. Lifelong friends avoided each other on Main Street. The violence at the motel had been averted, but the damage lingered. The church, once the center of unity, now stood like a fortress under siege. Some parishioners still came to Mass, clutching rosaries, begging God for peace. Others stayed away, saying Father Thomas had betrayed his own to side with outsiders. Margaret O'Connor prayed longer hours than ever before. Her knees ached, but she remained steadfast before the tabernacle, whispering, "Lord, do not let the enemy divide us beyond repair." Father Thomas, however, felt the weight of despair. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the rectory, haunted by faces Frank's children, the men at the VFW, the frightened developers at the motel. Could he really keep this town from destroying itself? Inside the VFW, Hank Miller's voice grew louder by the week. He mocked Father Thomas as a coward, sneered at Frank as a traitor, and painted himself as the only man willing to fight for a stay. "Jerome, we scared those suits good," he bragged one night. "Next time, we won't back down. They'll learn what happens when you mess with us." Some cheered. Others shifted uncomfortably. Not everyone wanted blood, but fear kept them silent. One younger man finally muttered, "I just wanted steady work." "Hank, not a war." Hank's glare silenced him. "If you don't have the stomach for it, get out." The atmosphere grew darker. It was no longer just about jobs or land. It had become about pride, anger, and power. On the feast of Christ the King, Margaret decided silence was no longer enough. She asked Father Thomas if she could speak after communion. When he nodded, she walked slowly to the front, clutching her rosary. Her voice trembled at first, but gained strength. "I've lived in this town 72 years. I've seen hard times. I've buried people I loved. But never have I seen us so ready to tear each other apart. My friends, if we keep down this road, there will be blood on our hands and emptiness in our souls." Her eyes swept across the pews. "You say you fight for a stay, Jerome? Then fight for it by loving your neighbor. Fight for it by refusing to become the very evil you despise. Because when the bells are silent, what else will remind us of who we are if not love?" Tears streaked her face. She sank back into her pew. Some clapped quietly. Others stared stone-faced. Hank was not in church that morning, but word of her speech spread quickly. 2 nights later, Hank and his men gathered again, this time with firearms on the table. "This town belongs to us," Hank snarled. "And if the church won't stand with us, then maybe the church needs to be taught a lesson." A younger man paled. "You're not talking about." "I'm talking about making them listen," Hank cut in. "The priest, that old woman, anyone who gets in the way." Frank, who had forced himself to attend the meeting, felt sick. He pushed back his chair. "No. This is madness." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Leave. Then. But remember, you walk out now. You're no brother of ours." Frank left. His hands trembled so badly he could barely start his truck. He drove straight to the rectory. Father Thomas opened the door to find Frank on the steps, pale and shaking. "They're going after the church," Frank whispered. "Guns, Father." They're planning something tonight. Father Thomas's blood ran cold. Tonight? Frank nodded. I couldn't stop them. But you need to get everyone out. Within an hour, the church basement where a youth group had been meeting was emptied. Margaret helped herd the children into cars, praying aloud as she went. Hail Mary, full of grace. Father Thomas refused to leave. He locked the doors of the church and remained inside, kneeling before the altar. If they come, Lord, let it be me, not my people. Around midnight, headlights appeared at the edge of the parking lot. Hank's truck rolled in, followed by two others. Doors slammed. Heavy boots struck the pavement. Frank was there too, parked in the shadows, torn between fear and duty. Inside, Father Thomas heard the crunch of gravel. He rose, heart pounding, and stepped outside into the cold night. The men froze when they saw him standing there, cassock billowing in the wind. You don't belong here, Father, Hank growled. Step aside. This is the house of God. Father Thomas replied. If you mean to harm it, you'll have to go through me. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Guns glinted in the moonlight. From across the lot, Frank shouted. Stop. Don't do this. He stepped into the glow of headlights, exposing himself. If you want someone to blame, take me. I spoke against you. Leave the church out of this. Traitor. Hank spat. He raised his rifle. Time seemed to freeze. Father Thomas stepped forward, spreading his arms as if to shield Frank. Margaret's words echoed in his head. What kind of man will you be because of your suffering? Shoot me. Then, the priest said. But understand this, every bullet you fire will not silence you, it will awaken us. And the God you claim to fight for will judge you for it. The men hesitated. Their breaths came in visible clouds of steam. The weight of eternity seemed to press on their shoulders. Finally, one lowered his gun. I can't do this, he muttered, turning away. Another followed. Then another. Hank stood alone, rifle still raised, rage burning in his eyes. He aimed but his hands shook. You're weak. He spat at the others. All of you. Then he lowered the gun. With a roar of frustration, he hurled it onto the ground. This isn't over. He stormed back into his truck. Engines roared. Tires spat gravel. And the men disappeared into the night. Silence fell over the churchyard. Frank collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Father Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder, tears of relief streaming down his own face. The bells may be silent, the priest whispered, but tonight, heaven itself rang. Margaret arrived moments later, clutching her rosary, out of breath from running when she saw the trucks. She sank onto the steps, whispering prayers of thanksgiving. But deep down, all three knew the struggle wasn't finished. The threat of violence remained. And yet, for the first time in months, hope flickered like a candle refusing to be snuffed out. The dawn after the confrontation broke cold and gray. The churchyard littered with tire tracks and the abandoned rifle. Father Thomas barely slept. Yet he rose early, vesting for morning mass as though nothing had happened. When the small congregation arrived, whispers filled the pews. They had heard news traveled fast and stay. Jerome. Some came out of curiosity. Others in trembling gratitude that violence had been avoided. Frank sat near the front for the first time in months. His wife, Ellen, clutched his hand as though she feared he might vanish. His children, wide-eyed, nestled against him. Margaret knelt 2 pews back, rosary in hand, eyes closed in thanksgiving. When the opening hymn began, the organ faltered. The old organist's hands shook too much to play steadily. Yet the voices of the people rose, uneven but sincere. It was the sound of a town wounded but still alive. Father Thomas stood at the pulpit, his voice hoarse yet steady. My brothers and sisters, last night this church stood under threat. Some would have burned it, silenced it, erased it. But we are still here. Why? Because God does not abandon his people. He paused, letting the words sink in. But hear me clearly, the danger is not over. The true danger is not outside these walls, it is here, within us. The danger that we will give in to anger, to vengeance, to fear. Violence nearly claimed us. It still might. But if it does, it will be because we allowed hatred to live in our hearts. His gaze swept the congregation. Christ did not come to give us comfort without cost. He came to show us how to suffer without becoming cruel. How to love when love seems impossible. That is our call. That is how to stay. Jerome will survive not by the strength of our fists, but by the strength of our faith. For a moment, silence filled the church. Then, unexpectedly, Frank stood. I was with them, he said loudly, voice trembling. I let anger blind me. And I nearly let it destroy us. I was wrong. I ask your forgiveness. Gasps rippled through the pews. Ellen squeezed his hand. Father Thomas nodded gently. And forgiveness is already yours, Frank. The cross was built for moments like this. That week, the sheriff visited Father Thomas. We can press charges, he said. We've got enough on Hank Miller to lock him away. Father Thomas hesitated. He wanted justice. Yes, but would jail he'll stay? Jerome. Or harden it? He gathered the parish council. Opinions split. Some wanted Hank punished severely. Others feared it would only make him a martyr. Finally, Margaret spoke. Justice matters. But so does mercy. If Hank is to face prison, let it not be out of vengeance, but out of love for his soul and for the safety of others. The council agreed. The sheriff arrested Hank. In court, Father Thomas testified truthfully yet without malice. Hank glared at him the whole time. But the priest's words never wavered. I pray for him daily. Hank was sentenced to several years. As the gavel fell, Frank bowed his head in sorrow not triumph. He knew Hank had once been his friend. Winter came. Snow-blanketed stay. Jerome in white silence. Yet inside Sacred Heart, the community slowly began to heal. Attendance grew again. People spoke across divides. Awkwardly at first. Then more warmly. In January, a team of volunteers gathered to repair the bell tower mechanism. Frank was among them, climbing the ladder with renewed determination. On a bright Sunday morning, Father Thomas grasped the rope. The congregation held its breath. With one pull, the bronze bell rang out, rich and clear, scattering pigeons into the sky. Children laughed. Elders wept. And Margaret whispered, "Thanks be to God." The sound rolled across the fields like a proclamation. The town was not defeated. As spring approached, Sacred Heart launched new efforts, a job training program in the parish hall, counseling groups for struggling families, and a renewed food pantry. Donations began to flow again. Not from wealthy outsiders, but from the hands of townsfolk determined to lift one another. Frank found work helping repair farm equipment. It wasn't the factory, but it was honest, steady, and it kept his family fed. Margaret became the quiet anchor of the parish, leading rosaries and mentoring younger mothers. Her fiery speeches gave way to gentle encouragement, though her eyes still flashed when justice was at stake. Father Thomas preached with renewed fire. Not the fire of anger, but of conviction born from trial. He reminded them often, our scars are not signs of defeat, but of survival. The bell tolled each Sunday, and though its sound was the same, it carried new meaning. Months later, as summer sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, Father Thomas ended a homily with words that would stay etched in the town's memory. Violence nearly defined us, but love reclaimed us. Este. Jerome will not be remembered for its fires or its divisions, but for how we chose peace in the midst of injustice. That is our witness to the world. The congregation rose for the final hymn. Frank sang loudly, his children at his side. Margaret's voice cracked but carried. Ellen's tears flowed freely. As the hymn ended, the bells rang again. And this time, the whole town listened.